The next speaker is Felicity Roberts, and she was an assistant on the Sloane's Treasures project, which was a networking grant that we had from the AHRC to work on ideas for reconstructing Sloane's collections. And we worked with the British Museum, the British Library, and the Natural History Museum, where Felicity was based. And she began her PhD by cataloguing an album of several hundred drawings of animals that belonged to Sloane. Today, she will present a paper with a slightly different title than the one that she advertised. It will involve animals, but her new title is Sir Hans Sloane's Museum, Visiting Collections and the Communication of Natural History in 17th and 18th Century England. Thank you.
Hello. So if I stand like this, can people still hear me? Great. So first of all, I have to apologise to Juan and the other Huntington organisers for ruining the wonderful booklet that they produced by changing my conference paper title. But I started out with Animal Encounters and then it became a slightly different paper. So there are still animals in there, but they're put in a broader context now. In July 1691, the apothecary James Petifer set off on an expedition to botanise and visit scientific collections across England. He visited, among others, the naturalist Richard Richardson, the Ashmolean, the Chelsea Physic Garden, the apothecary John Conyers, the Royal Society, the traveller William Corton, and the naturalist John Ray and Samuel Dale. He recorded the exhibition in a journal, writing in the preface, "Some will expect that I should give a reason why I took this journey in hand. In truth, I had no other occasion, neither was there anything in the world that compelled me to go, but only mere love to learning." Early modern natural history depended on the movement of goods, people, and information through commercial, scientific, and social networks to produce knowledge and value. Among naturalists, visiting collections of natural and artificial objects was popular because it enabled them to do natural history, to produce knowledge, but also by doing this, to become a naturalist, to exhibit one's knowledge of the tacit, epistemological, and social rules that guided the naturalist community, and to show oneself to be a member of it. In writing and sharing his journal, the authorial voice frequently imagines a sympathetic reader. Petifer was both recording valuable information and positioning himself as a curious naturalist with a mere love for learning, looking, and conversing, one who was well-travelled and well-connected. Visiting collections connected people with objects and information, and visiting accounts in journals, diaries, and correspondence reveal the activity and sensory material quality of natural history that is sometimes absent from published encyclopedia sources. But the practice of visiting also offered visitors the opportunity to shake collections up, open them to new meanings, and shape what their community's values and practices might be. The Oxford English Dictionary gives several meanings for the verb to visit, both to call upon someone in a friendly or sociable manner, and to call in order to observe or examine conduct or disposition, to make trial of, to subject to test or scrutiny. Visiting produced knowledge, people, and communities, but in so doing it also produced change. This paper draws on visits to the physician Sir Hans Sloane's museum and some accounts from his correspondence, kind of building on earlier papers in the weekend and discussions about scale and the senses that we've had, and the idea of kind of individual interactions within the collection in an age of taxonomy, in order to try to tease out some of the relationships between exploratory and sensory and classificatory qualities of natural history, to examine how the practice of visiting contributed to the making, remaking, and unmaking of natural history in late 17th and early 18th century England. And that's just some examples from Sloane's museum that you can see there, although we had a very good introduction from Vicky earlier in the morning. So, producing knowledge. So early modern natural history depended on the movement of goods, people, and information to produce knowledge and value. The practice of visiting collections linked people with objects and information. It had its roots in both the tradition of foreign travel by medical students and in the nascent idea of the Grand Tour. But as Anna Marie Roos has argued in her recent analysis of Pettifer's journal. Accounts such as his suggest that by the late 17th century, scientific peregrination, or the natural history tour, had developed into a separate enterprise. In late 17th and early 18th century England, naturalists made visits to collections such as museums, libraries, anatomical collections, botanic gardens and menageries, both at home and abroad, as well as welcoming visitors to their own. Collections could be privately owned or institutional. Most were semi-public, accessible through mutual acquaintances or a suitable letter of introduction. But the Ashmolean was theoretically open to the broader public on payment of an entrance fee, though, as Anne Golgar has noted, often in practice this public was more narrowly defined. Some collections were commercial, such as nursery gardens. Naturalists often wrote accounts of these visits in journals and letters and received and read accounts from others, though visits could also be a less formal affair. Visiting enabled them to see each other's collections, to closely examine and compare objects with drawings, books and other materials, to form opinions, to exchange and to describe and classify specimens. It enabled them to practice a hybrid, curious yet systematic form of natural history, which was explicitly sensory in its representation and ordering of objects. Visiting was valuable firstly because it allowed naturalists to gain first-hand empirical knowledge of other collections and objects. In this period in England, natural philosophy emphasised seeing for oneself and the mass collection of information or matters of fact as a preliminary method of investigation into the natural world. In his present state of natural philosophy, the Royal Society scientist and demonstrator Robert Hooke argued that the best remedy is to compare the several informations we receive of the same thing from the several impressions it makes on the organs of sense. Natural history was therefore a curious multi-sensory enterprise. In their natural histories, naturalists often gave detailed particulars in their descriptions of species, including form, growth, virtues, uses, colour, and so on. For example, Hans Sloane, in his Natural History of Jamaica, described the algae Corallium minimum capillaceum as, "This seems the same with the corallines for substance, smell, colour, etc. Only it is not near so large, neither is it discernibly jointed. It is not much bigger than a hair, and seems to have no thread within, but smells of the sea, crackles under the teeth, stands more upright as coral, and not bending because of the want of joints, in which it differs from the corallines, being otherwise very like the Corallina minima capillacea mentioned hereafter." Although in scientific correspondence of the period, references to visiting are often made in terms of viewing, seeing, or having sight of collections. As Constance Classen has shown, in addition to looking, visitors also touched, smelled, and tasted objects. In 1710, Sloane welcomed the German antiquary Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach to his museum in Bloomsbury and showed him around his collection of plants, animals, and mineral specimens, anatomical preparations, manuscripts, books, drawings, prints, coins, medals, statuary, and paintings. Uffenbach was escorted through a series of rooms and recorded the visit in his diary, in which he made particular reference to a Cochlea terrestris, a species of snail which, he noted, was especially remarkable, not so much for its elegance as for its curious breeding from a shell resembling an egg, such as we had seen in no other collections. Uffenbach held a specimen against the light so as to see the concam lying concealed within it. Uffenbach also looked over a cabinet of taxidermied birds and their nests, including several Southeast Asian swiftlet edible nests that were considered a delicacy. He examined such a nest further, tasting it and considering its flavour, texture and appearance to judge whether its material was formed in a sea or was gum resin. As Uffenbach's account makes clear, visiting was a multi-sensory, exploratory, intimate experience. It allowed him to view and handle things, to converse with their owner and to touch and taste objects, to supplement what he had read of them elsewhere. And here, actually, I was thinking from Lizzie's paper how the Duchess of Portland managed to examine the mummy's toes with Sloane. So they must have maybe unwrapped the mummy in order to have a look and got closer. But at the same time, during this period, naturalists were also beginning to struggle with the sheer amount of information they had generated while collecting, describing, and classifying natural objects over the previous centuries. And they were starting to seriously consider the systematic classification of species. In England, visiting collections enabled them to examine and compare specimens with examples seen in other collections and publications, to discriminate the fine differences between species, and so to compile their own mental catalogue of known species. In 1707, the naturalist Richard Middleton Massey wrote to Sloane to ask, "I send to Mr. Dixon at the Greyhound in Cornhill a stone which I brought out of Cheshire. 'Twas formed in the River Ribble near Preston in Lancashire. I don't remember ever to have seen you like, either in Mr. Llwyd or Dr. Woodward's collections. I send it up that you may tell me what it is, and Mr. Pettifer, if he pleases, may insert a draft of it in his Gazo-Phylacium." Here Massey makes reference to Edward Llwyd and John Woodward, famous for their comprehensive collections of stones, fossils and earths, before suggesting that the new specimen be figured in Pettifer's ongoing catalogue series, Gazo-Phylacium, which seemed to act as a kind of holding vessel for new finds for naturalists. Meanwhile, the country's greatest naturalist, John Ray, embarked on a taxonomic project to describe and classify the world's plants, resulting in the Historia Plantarum. As Philip Sloane has argued, partly because of the culture of matters of fact, he believed in classifying species using multiple characters, whereas French botanists such as Joseph Piton de Tournefort were beginning to focus on the characters of flower and fruit only. Description for Ray was not yet tied to classification, and so could admit particulars. Ray valued seeing things for himself, and once wrote to Sloane saying, "I am sorry that I had not leisure and opportunity when I was in London curiously to view your rare collectio of plants. I know I should have received much information and satisfaction thereby." Here it is interesting to note that when it was necessary to see as many specimens as possible, perhaps visiting was encouraged, partly because it was a good compromise. It enabled the visitor to examine objects closely without letting those objects out of the sight of their watchful owner. Naturalists did lend their collections to each other, but this often resulted in the loss or damage of specimens, or even worse, the publication of embargoed research. Because his great friend Ray found it impossible to travel, Sloane lent his precious Jamaica collections to him and to Samuel Dell. But when Sloane gave some duplicates to the naturalist William Sherard's brother at Sherard's behest, only for these, as he believed, to be published by a rival, the Queen's botanist Leonard Plukenet, thus depreciating Sloane's own project, the Natural History of Jamaica, Sloane felt aggrieved. Sherard, for his part, liberally clipped out specimens from Ray's herbarium when he had his hands on it, and Ray's kind of mutilated herbarium is now stored at the Chelsea Physic Garden. So visiting allowed naturalists to intellectually rather than physically possess each other's collections. Of course, they might publish objects from their collections, as in Richard Middleton Massey's example, but naturalists continue to want to consult objects either for verification or for practical use alongside drawings and books. And in this case, anatomy collections are particularly interesting. Karen Berkowitz has written on the systems of display of anatomical teaching collections, which saw students dissect bodies, handle preparations, and look at texts together. Naturalists therefore cared about access to collections, and Sherard, who, as we have seen, had at times a testy relationship with Sloane, expressed his gladness that Sloane had purchased his rival Plukenet's collection. So to paraphrase James Dalborgo, Sloane's collecting of collections therefore takes on a slightly different aspect than a simply indiscriminate one, as collecting for use and to kind of compile a collective memory of natural history. Naturalist exploratory and systematic interests could also combine in different ways, such as when, in 1720, Sloane invited his colleagues William Stukely and James Douglas to his house museum in Bloomsbury to perform a dissection of an elephant carcass. The dissection was conducted in the garden, and it would have been messy, with Stukely and Douglas getting inside the carcass in order to cut it up. As the carcass decayed, it would have begun to stink. In a letter to Sloane, Douglas even said that the carcass frightened him. Comparative anatomy was a relatively new, different form of systematization, and the Royal Society curator Nehemiah Grew had first used the term in English in the 1670s. Sloane and Stukely and Douglas's anatomy was comparative in that it looked at the appearance and function of the elephant's organs, comparing it to other animals. But it did not do this by setting this information in a scheme. It proceeded by the examination of particulars. As Stukely said in his account of the anatomy, "We took off a most delicate plexus of the arteries that ran upon the outward surface of the brain under the geometer, and extended it upon fair paper, which was left in the custody of Sir Hans Sloane." And here, that isn't actually the remains of Sloane and Stukely's elephant. It's from a dissection conducted by the colonial naturalist Monsieur Stukely, which Sloane acquired for kind of comparison alongside their elephant carcass. And you can see how they've kind of turned the elephant remains into something 2D and kind of translucent, and it's become more like a visual image. And here is Patrick Blair's image of his elephant, which Sloane also conducted, which I always find quite charming. So Stukely and Douglas and Sloane anatomized the elephant, but they also remarked on how the elephant's brain was very fine, explaining its understanding of music, language, gratitude, memory, revenge. And Stukely also remarked, their sense of smelling is very acute, and they are exceedingly pleased with odoriferous flowers. These visits were for a specific task. They point to the way in which objects once collected sometimes required more manipulation to make comprehensible. As Anita Guarini has noted, anatomy produced different experimental knowledges, which adds weight to Tim Burkhead and Anna Marie Roos's description of natural history tours as scientific peregrination and their work about science on the move. Can we consider these more informal visits truly visits, however? I don't intend to provide an answer, just to raise the question. Besides producing knowledge, visiting collections was valued because it produced new people. In late 17th and early 18th century England, visiting collections had long been part of a naturalist's education, with naturalists such as John Ray, Martin Lister, Edward Brown, Hans Sloane, and Tancred Robinson all making tours abroad. And here I want to note two things. The first is that English naturalists saw collections as places for acquiring visual and sensory expertise. Collections were spaces which were doubly disciplinary. So they created new disciplines and they disciplined people. On this subject, Robert Hooke is again the most vocal, writing in Of Earthquakes that a repository was where an inquirer might be able to have recourse, where he might peruse and turn over and spell and read the book of nature. Here Hooke makes an explicit reference to viewing and handling, while he notes that it would be for the most serious and diligent study of the most able proficient in natural philosophy. Daniela Bleichmar has written eloquently about late 18th century collections as spaces for learning to see in expert ways and for articulating notions of both order and taste, and of the need to write about reader-viewers or reader-viewer handlers, since eyes and hands work closely together. But I would argue that in England, examples such as that of Sloane and Diefenbach, or Mark Jenner's work on the physician Sir John Floyer's tasting habits, suggest that the whole body could function as a discriminating taxonomical instrument. The second is that besides providing visual and sensory training, visiting and viewing collections was thought to foster curiosity and a love to learning and be an inducement to further study. In the preface to the first volume of his Natural History of Jamaica, Sloane recalled that, "It is now 18 years since I went physician to the Duke of Albemarle to Jamaica. I had from my youth been very much pleased with the study of plants and other parts of nature, and had seen most of those kinds of curiosities which were to be found either in the fields or in the gardens or cabinets of the curious in these parts. The accounts of these strange things, which I met with in collections and was informed were common in the West Indies, were not so satisfactory as I had desired. I was young and could not be so easy if I had not the pleasure to see what I had heard so much of." In this extract, Sloane suggests that viewing collections and hearing accounts of the objects had a cumulative effect that led to his field trip to see at first hand the flora and fauna of Jamaica. Visiting took Sloane out of the collection and into the field. Visiting could help people and objects cross borders. On the other hand, visiting collections could also be associated with the development of visual and sensory blind spots, such as a focus on exotic to the exclusion of local plants. In 1703, the botanist Charles Preston, writing to Sloane to thank him for sending him a copy of Ray's follow-up to the Historia Plantarum, the Methodus Emendata, meditated on the problem of the systematic classification of plants. Doubting that the project could be achieved by one man, he therefore wished that botanists would restrict themselves to observations of the plants of their own country, observing exotic plants only according as they had occasion to be or to go to view them in gardens or elsewhere. Here, Preston argues for a balance between field and collections-based botany. In this way, Preston reasoned the reduction of plants to a certain method could be achieved. But for early modern naturalists, the practice of visiting collections was also an opportunity to exhibit as well as make knowledge. For both host and visitor, it was a chance to show first one's expertise and understanding of the tacit epistemological and social rules that guided the naturalist community and to declare one's membership of it. It was one of the principal ways, along with publishing and correspondence networks, that the natural history community showed itself to itself and came to constitute itself. And I don't have enough time to talk about all the possible ways in which the natural history community regulated itself, but here are a few from Sloane's archive. For the owner or curator of a collection, hosting enriched the collection through conversation and the exchange of objects. Uffenbach went away impressed that Sloane accompanied his group himself and could speak French, and that he had given so much time to the tour. The successful interaction was sealed when Uffenbach gave him a Lowenstein Histron Lithobus, a bezoar stone. It brought prestige to the collector and the collection, especially when the visitor was high profile, such as when in 1748 Sloane welcomed the Prince and Princess of Wales to his museum, newly based at Chelsea. The account of the visit that appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine was written by Cromwell Mortimer, secretary to the Royal Society and Sloane's librarian and assistant, and it portrayed Sloane almost like a magician, magicking away courses of objects to be followed by further tables laden with goods. These visits were also an important chance to do some early modern networking. It seems that the royal visit had been expected for some time, as a letter from the Royal Society scientist and curator of the observatory, Edmund Halley, to Sloane, dated September 1729, shows. Halley writes, "Her Majesty not having yet honoured the observatory with her royal presence, and finding by the newspapers that she with the Prince very soon intend you the favour of a visit, I humbly entreat you that when she comes, you would present me to her." For Halley, the prospect of a royal visit to Sloane's collection was an opportunity to raise his profile, and that of the observatory too, if it could be done without offence. Visiting was also an opportunity to cement genuine friendships, such as Samuel Pepys's almost casual invitation to Sloane to come view one of his new purchases, saying, "I having increased my collection of prints by a new volume or two that would not be irksome to your curiosity to overlook." But it was also an opportunity to secure one's legacy by training others in similar ways of seeing, examining, and interpreting the natural world. Over several years, Sloane welcomed several long-term visitors or protégés to his museum, including Humphrey Wanley, Alban Thomas, Johann Caspar Schweitzer, Cromwell Mortimer, Thomas Stack, William Empson, and George Edwards. I say protégés because he often promoted them to positions in the Royal Society or Royal College of Physicians. Wanley, Schweitzer, and Mortimer all enriched Sloane's catalogue and arguably came to practice natural history in the mould of their patron, with Schweitzer translating Engelbert Kampfer's Natural History of Japan for Sloane, and Mortimer contributing articles to the Philosophical Transactions. For Sloane, it was also a chance to spread his ways of classifying the natural world. In May 1733, members of the Royal Society paid a group visit to Sloane's museum to see how it was arranged, so that the Royal Society could restore their own repository accordingly. In contrast, for the visitor, it was a chance to develop one's reputation as a naturalist, to exhibit one's viewing ability, and to gain in social status accordingly. Younger naturalists sent accounts of visits in order to gain favour, such as this one from Sloane's grandson, Rosefuller, to Sloane, and it mentions a visit to the naturalist Frederick Roche's collection, in which he mentions examining an apricot to discover Roche's kind of hidden injection techniques. Can you see there? Roche refused to divulge this method. So that's yet another example of kind of an object hiding in plain sight in the museum. Humphrey Wanley also visited the print collector John Bagford's collection for Sloane, sending back a detailed description of the objects. It was a chance for visitors to display their learned sociality, such as when the antiquary Thomas Molyneux sent Sloane a poem after visiting his collection. And finally, it was an opportunity to collect people, such as when David Krieg made an album Amakoran, which is now in the Sloane Manuscripts collection, and which possibly came to him through Pettifer's papers, as it features Pettifer's signature inside. It was an opportunity to put oneself back into the collection to gain status by association, from gifting off objects such as Uffenbach's a bezoar stone, to making objects, for example, with Stukely's dissection, and finally for drawing objects, which we can see in the example of the artist George Edwards, who drew Sloane's menagerie and whose entire career was founded on Sloane's patronage. Sometimes these interactions were grossly mismatched in terms of power and agency. Another individual, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, a Muslim West African slave trader, arrived in London having himself been sold into slavery, and then, thanks to the interest of a tradesman and antiquary Joseph Ames, was brought to London, where he became the subject of immense interest. Diallo translated some inscriptions on some amulets for Sloane and circled in learned society with the eventual goal of purchasing his freedom. What can we make of Diallo? Was he really a visitor to Sloane's collection, if under such duress? But he was certainly a temporary guest of Sloane, and he contributed to the development of his museum. How do we draw the line? Again, I don't intend to give an answer, but to raise a question. Finally, in between, there existed another figure who put owners of collections and potential visitors in touch with each other, fulfilling the tricky role of a mediator in the visiting network. For Sloane, one of these figures was Arthur Charlotte, who sent several young scholars, accompanied by letters of introduction to Sloane over the years, including Humphrey Wanley in 1698. Yet, though frequently the practice of visiting collections survived through a coalition between the owner or curator of a museum and the visitor paying court, a tour of a collection could test or break that compact. The visit was a point at which a collection was opened up to potential reinterpretation and reuse. Visitors brought their own ways of viewing and dwelling with objects, and different people had different reactions. The visit was sometimes an occasion to assert or build new standards of seeing and classifying the world. In the early 18th century, the culture of natural history was slowly changing, and one of the significant outlets for those changes came through visits and the exchanges they promoted. In 1736, the Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus paid a visit to Sloane's museum. The author of a path-breaking system of classifying and describing plants, which, building on Tournefeuille's work, grouped them according to the flower and fruit, but then described them accordingly, therefore tying the description of species to a scheme, just published in his Systema Naturae. It was Linnaeus' first visit to Britain, and he duly called on prominent local naturalists and collections, including Sloane, Sloane's protege Philip Miller at the Chelsea Physic Garden, and the German transplant Johann Jakob Dellenius at the Oxford University Botanic Garden. While the meeting between Sloane and Linnaeus was apparently cordial, in a letter to his mentor Olaf Celsius, Linnaeus went on to describe Sloane's large collection as in a mess. In contrast, Linnaeus' meeting with Dellenius ended with their embracing and Dellenius' adoption of the sexual system of classifying plants. In his expedition to England, Linnaeus was using his visits to collections to turn himself into a more experienced naturalist, while simultaneously asserting to his Swedish compatriots his superior credentials and expertise, and arguably more visual interpretation of nature. Further, in 1742, the octogenarian Sloane welcomed another guest to his museum, Margaret Cavendish Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland, about whom we've already heard, the collector, naturalist, and patron of natural history. The Duchess of Portland was less than impressed by Sloane's assemblage of objects, writing to her friend Elizabeth Montague, "I'm just come from Sir Hans Sloane's, where I have beheld many things odder than himself, but none as inconsistent. However, I will not rail, for he has given me some of his trumpery to add to my collection. Until I get better, they shall remain there." At her home, Bulstrode Park, Bentinck amassed an enormous collection of shells, which, as Beth Fawkes-Tobin has shown, was both aesthetic and scientific. Bentinck collected good quality specimens, often polished to show better species characters, such as the patterning of a shell. Bentinck would go on to adopt Linnaeus' scheme and to employ one of Linnaeus' pupils, Daniel Solander, again in another kind of long-term visit, along with the Scottish naturalist John Lightfoot and another Linnaeus associate. I think it's the air conditioning. The artist Georg Ehret, to assist in the documentation and cataloguing of her specimens. While her practice remained a mixture of the visual and the tactile, Bentinck's criticism of Sloane was explicitly visual, as trumpery as that which is showy, it deceives the sight and is less valuable than it really is. It also illustrates the flip side of becoming a curious naturalist, which is that to some one becomes an oddity. However, though a visit to another naturalist collection or an account of it was an opportunity to assert different, perhaps more visual methods of observing, classifying and interpreting the natural world, or to reassert a difference already declared in print, this disagreement did not mean that naturalists then eschewed each other's collections. Classification continued to involve working with collections, and the calibration between hand and eye at least. And here we could think about the way most naturalists will also have done some preserving of objects. And I think it's striking that most of the visitor accounts always mention in what manner the objects have been mounted or preserved to varying levels of success, but it is something that everyone notices. In 1748, one of Linnaeus' students, the botanist and traveller Père Carme, about whom we've already heard, visited England, recording it all in a travel journal. On his master's orders, he made a visit to Sloane's collection, especially to view the snake Cobra de Capello, which has markings on its neck like spectacles, to make an account of its abdominal armour, the scuta abdominalia, and tail skin, the squamus caudales, again, looking at visual characteristics. Here, Carme also noted, though, that Sloane had a deeply sensitive and impressive insight into all branches of natural science. As both objective study and material memory of practice, collections were useful to naturalists over and above disputes. It is important to note that both Linnaeus and Bentinck's criticisms came in the medium of the letter rather than in person, so arguably the practice of visiting was an instrument for gradual change through the containment of serious dispute. Visitor accounts suggest a gap, perhaps, between textual accounts of natural history and natural history as it is enacted in material culture, what in Marco Beretta's words is described as collections and specimens tell stories that do not always agree with the text serving as their framework and introduction. Nor did it mean that natural history in its much broader sense was becoming less material. Sloane's messy sensory dissection of the elephant points to the emergence of comparative anatomy and an interest in function as serious issues in classification in late 18th century France, with Adanson and Jussieu and Cuvier's work, which led to a renewed focus on natural systems of classification of organisms. So I'm here thinking about Lisa Roberts' work on when systematization takes place and can it take place in waves depending on what objects you're working with. Linnaeus and Carme, for their part, continued to be interested in the economic uses of natural objects. While on his trip to England, Carme also took note of a street performer, a snake handler, and examined how he had removed its fangs in order to avoid its poisonous bite. Natural history was always more than just classification. To conclude, the practice of visiting collections was a crucial aspect of the communication of early modern natural history. Visits to museums, gardens, libraries and menageries were occasions which opened up the collection to broader economies of making and meaning. Visiting touched the collection, the owner and visitor alike. It shows the activity of natural history and the intertwined relationship between broader sensory investigations of natural history and the narrower classificatory efforts of naturalists. Visiting was also a power struggle. For Sloane and his associates, it presented the possibility of curious exchange, parallel to the interaction and revision practiced in the philosophical transactions. But visiting could challenge as well as remake natural history, such as in the examples of Carl Linnaeus and Margaret Cavendish Bentinck, the Duchess of Portland. In a codicil to his will, signed in 1751, Sloane appointed both a set of trustees and a set of visitors to help run his museum after his death. And incidentally, it seems from a letter here at the Huntington by his grandson, Hans Stanley, Sloane's codicilling caused uncertainty and friction in the family. Stanley writing wryly of his elder that he had been possessed his whole life by the spirit of codicilling, and having made alterations of that sort the chief pastime of his vacant hours. And actually, Stanley came back to support the family and sort of kind of keep an eye on Sloane, I think, to ensure that the succession proceeded safely. In the will, Sloane requested, being assured that nothing will conduce more to this purpose, that his collection be preserved and continued in its entirety, then placing the same under the direction and care of learned, experienced and judicious persons who are above all low and mean views, I do earnestly desire that the King and at least 20 other people, I can't list them all, will condescend so far as to act and be visitors of my said museum and collection. And I do hereby, with their leave, nominate and appoint them visitors thereof, with full power and authority for any 5 or more of them to enter my said collection or museum at any time or times, to peruse, supervise, and examine the same and the management therefore, and to visit, correct, and reform from time to time as there may be occasion, either jointly with the said trustees or separately upon application to them for that purpose. In appointing a group of learned, experienced, and judicious persons as visitors to his museum, Sloane was following the example set by England's first public museum, the Ashmolean, which appointed a board of visitors in the late 17th century. And unlike the British Museum, the Ashmolean's board of visitors does still survive. Sloane's will caused the foundation of the British Museum and brought collections further into the public era. His will speaks to Sloane's desire that his museum should be kept entire. It is an attempt to control the collection's audience from beyond the grave. But it is also a formal acknowledgement of the need that collectors and collections had for the visitor, and the authority of the visitor in having the power to inspect collections. Sloane's will also produced 2 types of visitor who would go on to make many different meanings from Sloane's collection henceforth. So the authoritative visitors who examined the collections, and the public visitors who were sort of begrudgingly admitted access by the new custodians of Sloane's museum. This doubling encapsulates one of the central paradoxes of visiting in the early modern period, that it contributed to the making, remaking, and unmaking, in short, the communication of natural history. Thank you.